A very warm welcome. Tonight at Hyde Park, we've invited to our studios a politician and an academic, of course, to discuss the way forward under a possible SLPP government. We've invited to our studios a former External Affairs Minister, a former academic, a Minister of Justice then, and also several other subject ministerial positions that he held under various governments since 1994. I have with me the chairman of the Sri Lanka PODUJANA PERAMUNA joining me today, Professor G.L. Peiris. Thank you very much for your presence here at Hyde Park.
Not at all. Pleasure.
Let me first ask you, since we're talking about a possible SLPP government, and that is why you're asking your voters to elect the SLPP into government. Why should they vote for the SLPP?
I think there's one major reason which is all too evident all over the country. We've campaigned in every district virtually, and there is a very strong feeling that the country must elect a parliament, a cabinet, a government which can work in harmony with the president who has already been elected on a resounding mandate. He was elected on a specific program of work. Now, in order to implement that program, he needs a strong majority in parliament. And the country has seen the consequences that arise from a situation where the president belongs to one party, is pulling in one direction, and the cabinet and the prime minister are at odds with the president. The result is a state of anarchy, and the people who suffer are the public. Now, the country has had painful experience of that anarchical situation from, let's say, 2017 to 2019 in particular. And the last thing they want is a repeat of that. So they are pleased with what President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has done during the last 6 months. Effective leadership, strong government, control of COVID-19, dealing with the underworld, the whole problem of drugs, the steps that have been taken, very strong, vigorous, effective, not mere words, action on the ground. To continue this, you must have a parliament that is in tandem, which is in step with the president, not obstructing him, not having conflicts with him all the time. And so the country feels that in order to benefit fully from the change which they brought about on the 16th of November last year, that there really must be a strong government which works productively with the elected president.
This is quite similar to what the United National Party says to end the Samagi Jana Balavege. Now, when we spoke to the United National Party, the leader says their policies are placed well in line with President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's vision for the country, their economic policies specifically. Why do you think that the SLPP will do better with the President Gotabaya Rajapaksa when the UNP is believed to have better economic policies for the country?
So if the country accepted what the UNP says, that their economic policies are better and will bring greater dividends to the people, why was the UNP candidate or the UNP supported candidate defeated by a margin of 1.4 million votes? How come President Rajapaksa polled 6.9 million votes in the country? Is there a vote of confidence in the economic policies of the UNP? That is totally lacking in credibility. The economic policies have been decisively, resoundingly rejected by the people. And why would the people want a resurrection of policies which they have convincingly said they do not want at any price?
Now, the presidential candidate of the UNP then has his own party, so it's divided there too. But the UNP says it's a brand new. It's the policies representative of the UNP ideology that is promising and pledging a new Sri Lanka alongside the leadership of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. At the same time, it is the coalition led by the UNP and the SLFP that was rejected by the people with the mandate of the presidential election this time. What are your thoughts here?
No, what was rejected by the people was a government which had ruled the country in partnership between the UNP and the SLFP. That did not work at all. I mean, the conflicts were not just personal, but ideological, policy-oriented. And what better proof do you want of that than the fact that 265 lives were lost because the government failed singularly in its basic duty to protect life and limb in this country, having all the information that they needed to stop this horrendous calamity. On the day that it happened, I was in Germany, and as I read the papers in the morning, so I read the New York Times, and you can check that on page 1. There were details about the people who were involved, names, telephone numbers, addresses, all of this was known. Indian intelligence had brought it to the notice of the Sri Lankan government, but nothing whatsoever was done. Why? Because there was no government. There was an internal tug of war. And the evidence that is now transpiring every day before the Presidential Commission, which has been appointed by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, is really, really frightening. With all this information in specific detail at the disposal of the government, why were they not able to take the basic steps that were necessary not to develop the economy, not to improve social relations, but to keep people in the country alive, to prevent a massacre? That is because that whole experiment failed. And this is why the people are certainly not friendly to any revisitation of that kind of arrangement, which has spelt unmitigated doom to our country.
We are at challenging times. The entire globe is facing a crisis surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent economic crisis that follow as a result of what's happening here. And Sri Lanka is also facing the effects of these challenges. Any government that comes to power will have to have a fresh set of policies and measures to overcome this situation. What is the SLPP proposing to do if you are elected to power?
Well, I think
to add to that, in the immediate first few months.
Yes, in the immediate first few months, indeed in the immediate first few weeks, we will have to direct our attention to the kinds of changes that are necessary because of the COVID-19 situation. The principal change is that some sources of foreign exchange that we anticipated will not be forthcoming because of COVID-19. Tourism is one obvious example. We won't get the money that we anticipated. It is also true of Sri Lanka's exports, the apparel sector in particular, and also the remittances from the Middle East, from our workers there. That's a very substantial source of foreign exchange. So those are largely drying up in the present and the immediate future. And there has to be some innovative thinking with regard to how we are going to redress that balance. But I think not only the country, the world is aware of the effectiveness of the measures that have been taken here to control COVID-19 with our limited resources. Compare Sri Lanka with some of the leading economies of the world. As we speak, in the United States, 4.5 million people have been afflicted with this disease, and 175,000 people have lost their lives. Contrast that with the situation in Sri Lanka. The numbers are in the 2,000s infected, and 11 people died. That didn't just happen. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the result of strong leadership, proper coordination among the health authorities, the intelligence arm of the government, all of them acting in unison, inspired, enthused, and invigorated by a strong leadership. So that is a singular achievement.
But there's a lot of opposition also surrounding the measures that were taken, that there should have been more effort put together by the present setup by the government, that more relief should have been given to the people, because many are suffering, from those who had day jobs to SMEs and then ordinary citizens, because economic activity came to a standstill, and that the government failed to look at relieving the people of the immediate burden pushed down by the challenges of COVID-19.
No, I would disagree with that fundamentally. I mean, economic activity had to be affected necessarily. It was affected all over the world. But consider how difficult were the things that had to be done, and the very considerable measure of success that was achieved. For instance, is it easy to deliver to people's doorsteps the food, and in particular the medicines that they require during the lockdown? That was essential, absolutely necessary at that time. That's no easy exercise to organize that whole thing. The credit to that goes to Mr. Basil Rajapaksa, principally, under the direction of the president, because he was the chairman of the task force that was set up to see that the delivery of essential services continued. Then look at the other achievements. How were people retrenched? I mean, in this situation, there were very successful negotiations with the Employers' Federation, and we saw to it that there were minimum layoffs. People didn't lose their jobs, and those of them who had to stay at home, couldn't come to their places of work, were not deprived of their incomes. Arrangements were made with regard to employees in hotels who were affected by the fact that there were no tourist arrivals at all. The hotels were given a moratorium with regard to the repayment of loans. A lot of imaginative thinking. Now take the apparel sector. They could no longer produce goods for niche markets in the UK and the United States, for Victoria's Secret or for Marks and Spencer, and there was a complete shift of the kinds of commodities they were producing. They were producing PPE, personal protection equipment, PPEs, right? So government helped them to do that, to get orders for the kinds of things that the world was asking for in that dramatically changed situation, that enabled them to keep their production lines open, to keep their employees working and being paid during that period. These were no mean achievements, and the people of the country are aware that in a situation where there was absolute despair, because we were not prepared for it, nothing like that had ever happened in this country, so we had to improvise, innovate, and the success that was achieved was really, really remarkable. And also don't forget that crisis and the response to that crisis demonstrated the inherent strength of Sri Lanka's health system, which was rooted in our culture, compassion. There are some countries who, as a matter of law, excluded from ventilators and even hospital beds people who are above a certain age. They would not offer medical treatment to people who had existing or subsisting conditions. This was because of the demand, so they excluded these people. In Sri Lanka, it was unthinkable that we would turn away somebody who was above a certain age. We catered for everybody. And another major challenge that we successfully dealt with was bringing back to this country our employees who had spent years, decades of their lives earning valuable foreign exchange for the Sri Lankan exchequer. They found themselves in dire circumstances in those countries. We brought them back. About 60% of those who were wanting to come back have already returned. Students who were stranded in those countries, we are bringing back the rest gradually. So all of these had to be planned, they had to be coordinated, and they had to be done in a manner which did not pose a threat to health of the public in our own country. And these, I would say, are phenomenally challenging measures which were successfully taken.
On that note, we'll take a short commercial break at Hyde Park. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're joining us at Hyde Park, and we're in discussion with Chairman of the Sri Lanka PODUJANA Professor G.L. Peiris. Since 1994, you have been, you saw the political culture changing in Sri Lanka. A lot of key changes that we saw, constitutional changes as well as changes in terms of how parties were represented. But going forward, you're asking a mandate to set up a single party government. You're asking for a strong majority. How do you think the composition of parliament will be here?
No, when you say a single party government, we are not in any way denigrating the role of the opposition. There must be a strong opposition in the interest of democracy. Unfortunately, I don't think there will be in the new parliament because of all the dissension and the conflicts within the main segments of the opposition. But what we will offer the country is not an arrogant government, but a government that will be sensitive to public opinion in all sectors. Now, in order fully to achieve that, I think that some constitutional reforms are urgently necessary. You spoke of what needs to be done within the first few months. It was the Emperor Napoleon who said that a new government wanting to do difficult things must address those tasks immediately. Now, one of those tasks would be electoral reform. If you want a government that really reflects the views of the public, I think constitutional reform, electoral reform are absolutely necessary. You know, the present system really brings out the worst in human nature, the manapa, the preference voting system, because colleagues within the same party, within the same government are ferociously competing with one another for preference votes. Then look at the amount of money that is spent. If you look at the news in the evening, your channel or any other channel, just work out the amount of money that candidates are spending for their advertisements is mind-boggling. So that is the antithesis of an equitable democracy. Can ordinary folks, candidates, afford that kind of money? If you revert to a system which enables a candidate to contest the Ratmalana constituency or the Devila constituency, then you can manage with a limited budget. But here you can't contest Ratmalana or Devila, you have to contest the entire Colombo district. All those are very necessary changes. That is with regard to electoral reform. Then other changes which are equally necessary. Now, we are talking of independent commissions, the 17th Amendment and the 19th Amendment. Are these commissions really independent? Does anybody believe that they are independent? You have a member of the Constitutional Council exhorting the public not to give a two-thirds majority to a particular political formation. You have a member of the National Elections Commission telling people not to vote for a particular political party, quite publicly in an interview on television like this interview. Right? So are these bodies apolitical? They are politicized beyond belief. They are instruments of, actually, of party politics. So isn't it time to take a fresh look at this? The idea is very good. That is to ensure that the most important appointments in the country, in the judiciary, in the police service, in the public service, are made not by party politicians, but by independent people. The aspirations is laudable, but the reality on the ground is a far cry from the aspiration. So we have to see what changes are necessary to give effect to those aspirations. And I think so we have our work cut out for us. These are some of the things that we have to do very early in the piece after the formation of the new government.
What's the stance of the SLPP on the question of the 19th Amendment if you set up an SLPP-led government?
You know, with regard to the 19th Amendment, there are things that everybody would agree have to be changed. Right? According to the 19th Amendment, the citizen of another country, even if he happens to be a citizen of Sri Lanka also, cannot contest elections here. Out of the question. Can't. But the body holding elections for the whole country is the National Elections Commission. So a citizen of a foreign country can sit on the Elections Commission as a member, and one member of the Elections Commission is a foreign national. So does that make sense? Isn't there an obvious contradiction? The 19th Amendment says that the Elections Commission shall consist of a chairman and 2 other people. What do you think the quorum is? The quorum is 3. Membership is 3, quorum is 3. I have not come across such a legislative provision anywhere in the world. What happens if one member decides for whatever reason to boycott the commission? The commission can't function at all. The entire electoral process comes to a grinding halt. It falls to the ground. These are not acceptable. I don't think in the new parliament anybody at all will quarrel with the necessity to make those obvious changes. So we have to revisit the 19th Amendment. There may be other more controversial matters which will require discussion, but let's start with the things with regard to which there will be a universal consensus. We can't leave those as it is, because those are dangerous provisions. They can result to a total breakdown of governance in the country. And let's start with the things which will not generate furious controversy. And then as you go along, let's address the more difficult issues and come up with a constitutional framework which will enable the aspirations of the people to be met in a reasonable time frame, 5 years, which the new government has.
I'd like to move on to talk a little about foreign policy and external affairs minister. You've been under the government of CBK and then under President Mahinda Rajapaksa. You've also been in the 2001 UNP government. But let's talk about your personal views and as a politician what you believe Sri Lanka's foreign policy direction should be. You were a strong proponent of economic diplomacy during your tenure as foreign minister. Is that still what you believe Sri Lanka should follow?
Yes, I think so. I think that should be the principal task of our missions abroad. Not political diplomacy. We are not a major political power on the world stage. But do you know that even ambassadors and high commissioners representing some of the largest countries in the world, some of the most powerful countries in the world, are spending a great deal of time on economic diplomacy in Colombo, pushing their companies of their countries are very proper, very legitimate. Now that is what we need to do. I think we must make it clear to our missions abroad that they must focus on investment into this country, trade, and they should be assessed from time to time how effective they have been. So of course we must first create in this country an environment that is conducive to investment. During the Yahapalana period there was no question of inspiring confidence in anybody. But once we set up a strong government, and we must identify the areas in which we would welcome investment, particularly investment into the services sector, skills development. Our young people are not lacking in sensitivity or perception at all. They're very intelligent. They want opportunities to improve themselves, which we have to do. Not just the traditional universities, but technical colleges, polytechnics, creating new streams in the curricula, technology. The IT sector in this country can be expanded threefold. So you need people to service that sector, people who are adequately equipped, and investment into those fields, the agricultural sector, power generation. So we have to prioritize, and we have to insist on our foreign missions working very actively to achieve those objectives.
But the common criticism by the opposition against your camp is that you failed to strike a balance between the superpowers in terms of foreign policy, that the West, China, India. So how are we looking at managing these superpowers?
No, Sri Lanka's foreign policy does not depend on an exclusive relationship with any one country. Countries will have differences among themselves. But we don't get involved in those. This point was made very clearly by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa in his inaugural speech when he addressed the people of the country from the precincts of the Ruang Valisaya in Anuradhapura. He said, we will not allow Sri Lanka to be used for the benefit of one country at the expense of another country. They are all our friends. Reciprocally, we expect those countries to respect our independence, our sovereignty, our autonomy of action. That is the cornerstone, the foundation of Sri Lanka's foreign policy. You know, we are prepared to articulate and defend our position in any forum, provided that we are given a fair hearing. The criteria must be objective. Now, this has been a criticism of the actions of some international organizations, that they have already made up their minds and they adopt a stance, a posture in regard to Sri Lanka, which has very little to do with Sri Lanka's welfare, but is tailor-made to cater for vested interests in their own countries. I mean, we have had extreme examples of that. Leaders of countries addressing the Tamil diaspora in their countries, thanking the diaspora for the help that they have given in elections held in those countries. You know, we are not against the Tamil diaspora. We want to work with them, but objectivity is very important in judging Sri Lankan situations. We welcome criticism. We like people to express critical views. But there must be the conviction on the part of the people of Sri Lanka that these are well-meaning criticisms. What these people have in mind is the well-being of our people, not the promotion of interests of other countries, of leaders of other countries, political parties in other countries. That will be lacking in credibility and will not achieve the kind of resonance that is required for criticisms to be taken seriously and acted upon.
I'd like to speak more on this topic, but after this short break at Hyde Park. To stay with us. Welcome back. We were discussing the direction of Sri Lanka's foreign policy. Sri Lanka still remains a focal point of the United Nations Human Rights Council, and after withdrawing from Resolution 30/1 on the basis of it being sponsored against the wishes of the people, there continues to be a focus, and Sri Lanka requires to address this question. How do you think we need to go about this?
Certainly there are questions we need to address, but there is absolutely no reason for these issues to be addressed by foreign bodies, foreign judges.
But how will Sri Lanka engage with them?
We will engage with them by saying, you know, we have local mechanisms which are strong, which inspire confidence. Sri Lanka's constitution does not enable judicial power in this country to be exercised by foreign tribunals. It is categorically excluded by the provisions of Sri Lanka's constitution. So we will set up our own mechanisms which are accountable and responsible to our own people, not to foreign bodies. Which self-respecting country can submit to the judgment of a foreign body every 6 months? You submit a report to a foreign body every 6 months. You have to satisfy them about the steps that you have taken. Is that compatible with a minimum degree of self-respect? And don't forget that, you know, what has been the assessment of people who have led these bodies? Prince Hussein, who was the Human Rights Commissioner during the time when I was Foreign Minister. He served his term of 5 years, then he could have had a second term. What did he say? Now, these are the words of Prince Hussein, not my words. He said, I can have another term, but in order to have it, I must bend my knee in supplication. Bend my knee in supplication. He must make obeisance, pay homage to the powers that be. He cannot act in accordance with his conscience. There is too much pressure being brought to bear on him. So he said, I value my probity, my rectitude, and my conscience. And if I can't do my job in keeping with my conscience, I would rather leave the job behind and go home. He went away. He said it. At the time he relinquished his position, he said, in order to continue to function in this capacity, I have to bend my knee in supplication, and I'm not prepared to do that. Now, that does not inspire too much confidence in those bodies. So that is why we are not prepared to submit reports, like a student submitting a report to a headmaster. If the headmaster is absolutely objective and interested only in the well-being of the student, that is fine. But if the headmaster has other masters to serve, and if the headmaster says, I can't do this job because I'm told what to do and what not to do. So we can't, absolutely, categorically, we are not going to submit this country to the judgment of other countries. This does not mean that we do not welcome constructive suggestions and proper engagement with those countries. But in the ultimate analysis, the formulation of policy in this country must be in the hands of the elected parliament of Sri Lanka. But we are certainly prepared to address issues of accountability. We will set up mechanisms which are credible, which are capable of delivery, and which are compatible with the country's culture, its institutions, and its ideological environment.
Talking about foreign policy and countering UNHRC allegations, I come back to our foreign policy and economic diplomacy that you spoke of. Again, we have a lot of issues to be dealt and addressed internally, our economic, our GDP, our growth, our exports, as you spoke about it, investments, bringing investments into the country. Again, there have been a lot of allegations against the former government of former President Mahinda Rajapaksa then, that certain key investments were given to China, strategic positions were given of areas of the country were given to Chinese investors. But at the same time, we're talking about managing the United States also, where our largest importer is. How do we look at this also spurring economic growth within the country? Because the allegation is that the UNP has good resources and the brains to handle the challenges posed on the country on the economic front. How do we look at that?
There are two parts to your question. On the first part, yes, there was investment by China into Sri Lanka. There were loans that were obtained from China. But that was for productive purposes. The port city is going to bring enormous benefits, and even the Yapala government conceded that when they wanted that project to go ahead. But the Magampura port in Hambantota, it had potential, it was making progress. We had already paid a substantial part of the loan at the time the government changed. What did the UNP government do? They used the Mattala airport to store paddy. That was an act of derision, simply to spite the Rajapaksa government. So those investments were not given a chance to produce the kinds of results that they had the potential to produce. But this other claim, now I have heard that repeated over and over again, the United National Party and the Honorable Ranil Wickremesinghe saying, whatever other people can do, the one thing they cannot do is to run the economy. It's a UNP and the UNP alone that has managerial expertise with regard to the running of the economy. It's totally false. Now, I will give you these figures which speak for themselves. GDP growth 2010 to 2014 was the Rajapaksa period, right? 2010 to 2014, during the Rajapaksa government, the rate of growth was 6.8%. In 2019, at the tail end of the Yapal regime, that fell to 2.3%.
Yes. Now, when I questioned at Hyde Park itself about the same economic figures, 2.2%, they allude to the aftermath of the Easter attacks and the challenges posed on the economy during that year, 2019, which is why Sri Lanka's growth plunged to 2.2%.
No, that is not at all a plausible reply, because take every other statistic, per capita income. Are people getting richer or poorer? In 2005, when we took over the government, the per capita income was $1,242. By 2014, that is after 9 years of rule by the Rajapaksa government, we were able to increase it to $3,819 US. What was it in 2019 when the UNP government came to an end? It was 3,852. So in 5 years, they were able to increase the per capita income of this country by just $33 US. Now they talk of exports. They're wizards at exports, growth of exports. In 2014, that is at the end of the Rajapaksa government, the value of our exports was approximately $11.1 billion US. Do you know what it was in 2019 after 5 years of Yahapalana rule? It was exactly the same. Not one bit of improvement. What happened to our foreign reserves? Under the management of Yahapalana in 2014, at the end of our government, it was foreign reserves were $8.2 billion US. Then in 2019, it fell to $7.6 billion. It came down. Every statistic, the devaluation of currency, immediately relevant to our people, the money that they use to buy what they need. In 2006, the rate of exchange, the rupee against the dollar, 131.05 rupees to the dollar. In 2015, 181.63. So in every respect, that is, during our period, the rupee was devalued only by 2.8% per year. During their period, 6.7% per year. The value of the rupee fell. That means everything was that much more expensive. People had to pay more for their food and everything else that they needed. So these statistics prove conclusively, it's not anybody's opinion, but these statistics prove conclusively that the UNP's economic management was a total disaster.
We'd like to speak more after this short break at Hyde Park. To stay with us. Welcome back. We're in discussion with Professor G.L. Peiris, Chairman of the Sri Lanka PODUJANA PERAMUNA, a former External Affairs Minister, and you held several ministerial positions in governments from former President Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga to former President Mahinda Rajapaksa's. I'd like to talk a little about the national question. This is a matter that Sri Lanka has failed to give a lasting solution to. How will a future government, and how should, in your view, look at this key issue that has affected Sri Lanka's forward march?
Well, that's certainly one of the matters that will receive attention. I think the first step is to reconstitute, to re-establish the provincial councils. For 2 years, there have been no provincial councils in this country. So the demand for provincial councils came principally from the northern province and the eastern province. And in terms of the 9th schedule to the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, there are as many as 36 important functions which are devolved to the provincial councils. The central government has no role to play. Those are exclusive competencies. So what the Yahapalana government did was they simply refused to hold provincial council elections. They knew they were going to be defeated in a humiliating way. So they saw to it that the elections were not held. There's a complete hiatus in that regard. The present government, our government, has announced that we would like to hold those elections as soon as possible, because provincial councils are at the moment a part of our constitution. So in evolving a lasting solution to what is called the national question, it will be important to consult the provincial councils as well. That therefore is a necessary step. So we will hold the provincial council elections, and we will talk to the elected representatives of those provinces, the north and the east, ascertain their views, But again, I must stress that this whole matter requires a consensus with the majority community as well. I think one of the basic weaknesses of the policy that was followed by the Yahapalana government was that they simply left the majority community out of account. They do not regard the majority community as important or needing to be consulted in a serious way. We have to carry all the people with us.
Well, what sort of a mechanism do you propose that we bring the majority and the minorities in question together to discuss this? And also another question: are we looking at constitutional reforms, or are we looking at how do we expect to arrive at a lasting solution?
No, constitutional reforms may be necessary, but before that, it was found during the last few years that the monies that were sent to the Northern Provincial Council to be used for development there, for the benefit of the people of the North, were not utilized at all. About 60% of it came back to the Sri Lankan Treasury. So they did not have the capability to spend the money that was allocated to them. That has nothing to do with the Constitution. It has simply to do with institutional deficiencies. So those have to be addressed. You can't blame the central government for the inactivity of the Northern Provincial Council, because they had the resources at their disposal. They were simply not able to spend the money in ways that were beneficial to their people. So those have to be addressed. There has to be capacity building, and once the new parliament is constituted with representation from those provinces, also with the agreement of the rest of the country as well, we need to address this in a non-confrontational way to build middle ground, and that will certainly be done. So the Tamil National Alliance would also have to work with us. We are certainly prepared to reach out to them. And there has unfortunately been the impression in this country that the TNA was very closely aligned to the UNP, and was almost a kind of adjunct to the UNP government, supporting them at every turn, sustaining a UNP government in office, providing legal and other expertise for a UNP government. I think there is now a realization that they have to work with a government in power for the benefit of their people. And we are certainly prepared to reciprocate, to respond to any constructive overtures that are made by the TNA, and sit down with them and have a proper, in-depth, serious discussion directed towards a practical solution to these issues.
The new threat of extremism after April 21st of 2019, the Easter Sunday attacks, Sri Lanka saw a fresh wave of extremism that Sri Lanka was unknown to. But these extremist groups had been operating in the country for decades. How can we look at combating these? Because most of our youth have suffered as a result, and also looking at youth participation in a more developed, advancing Sri Lanka, there is a necessity to wipe out extremist ideologies from the country. What mechanisms should we deploy here?
Absolutely, there is a dire need to do that. But then, as we speak in Sri Lanka, the Yahapalana government simply dismantled the intelligence apparatus. The intelligence apparatus was to them an embarrassment. The less seen of them, the less heard from them, the better. And that is what brought about this situation where there was no serious attempt to receive information, to evaluate information, to act on what the government was told by the intelligence authorities. They were simply shoved aside. We have to change all that, and today there are no restrictions on money that is coming into the country. It should come through the external resources department. But we have ministers, we have officials receiving huge sums of money through informal channels from abroad. There's no accounting for those monies at all. Now, if you look at the Kapankudi University, its buildings can be compared with Peradeniya or with Colombo universities, in fact far better. So where did these monies come from? Was it done in a proper way? There must be audited accounts. We must know. I'm not for a moment suggesting that money should not come in from abroad. We must know the source of those funds, the purposes for which it is expected to be utilized. There must be audited accounts. And much of this money was used to finance these extremist operations, madrasas and others. They have to be, some form of regulation is necessary. Otherwise, you sow the seeds of extremism in young minds. That is important. And basically, you have to bring the moderate Muslims into the mainstream. Moderate Muslims are 98%. And nobody suffered from this as much as the moderate Muslims. So there is today an increasing need for the Muslim community to be integrated into the mainstream. They must not see themselves as a group that is isolated from the mainstream. And the way they can serve their community is by identifying with a major political party, not these sectarian, communal parties, small parties. Because if you look at Sri Lanka's political history, Muslims have been at the very top of the UNP, the Slpp. They have held major positions in those parties. Muslim has been chairman of the UNP. Muslim has been Minister of Education in an Slpp government. Muslim has been a governor of the Western Province under a government of ours. So there is no need for them to form their own parties and to behave in a manner that marks them out from the activities of the mainstream. The solution is to integrate them. And recently, some of the speeches that have been made by Mr. Ali Sabri, who is on our national list, have been very constructive, very helpful in advocating the kinds of attitudes and perceptions that will be helpful to achieve this purpose.
We'd also like to talk a little more about Sri Lanka's economic growth and our way forward, how we cement our position in South Asia and in the region. We have the final 2 minutes on the show, but a bigger, greater, more prosperous Sri Lanka we speak of. We speak of Sri Lanka being the hub of the Indian Ocean for logistics to finances, but realistically, where can we place Sri Lanka in the next 10 years in the short term, but also in realizing a longer-term goal for the nation?
If we structure our policies properly, you mentioned young people, we must focus on, the vast majority of our young people who qualify for admission to universities in our country are not admitted, not through any fault of theirs. There's no room for them in the universities. So if we are able to train them, equip them, then what is Sri Lanka's basic strength? The caliber of our human resources. So if we can develop those human resources, then certainly that will contribute to making Sri Lanka a digital hub, a hub for communications, for trade, all of that. And the wealth that we need to tap and exploit for that purpose is our young people. And that is one of the priority areas of our government, the development, the improvement of youth and training them to equip them for life and for social mobility.
Thank you very much for your time here at Hyde Park, Professor G.L. Peiris.
Not at all. Thank you very much.
We had with us Professor G.L. Peiris, former External Affairs Minister, former Justice and Constitutional Affairs Minister, and also a minister who was charged of Ethnic Affairs and National Integration. An academic, the former Vice Chancellor of the University of Colombo and Rhodes Scholar of the University of Oxford, who is now the chairman of the Sri Lanka PODUJANA PERAMUNA, joining us at Hyde Park. Thank you for watching. Good night.